All right, everyone, welcome, welcome. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Marlene Montañez. I'm the Associate Director here at Long Beach Forward, and we are very excited to have y'all joining us here on a Friday afternoon. We're really, really happy to be hosting this training, and we could not be having this conversation or acknowledgement around land use without first acknowledging that we are streaming from occupied Tugba land in modern day Long Beach, acknowledging that we are an occupied land. Also, I would love to talk about Long Beach Forward. And at this point, I should have this written tattooed somewhere, but I want to remind folks that our mission is to create a healthy Long Beach with low-income communities of color by building community knowledge, leadership, and power with the vision and hope of race and income not determining one's future in Long Beach. It's a community where everyone is safe, connected, and healthy. And we work every day at Long Beach Forward to make that possible. So just reminding you all, and I see a couple of familiar faces of people that are always part of our work. And I just want to give a shout out to everyone that makes our work at Long Beach Forward possible by advocating, attending meetings, bringing in leaders, and doing all the hard work in order to advocate and make Long Beach a better place, because Long Beach Forward is just a building, but it's only possible through community. So I just want to take that moment to acknowledge and celebrate all the leadership and love that is transmuted through our organization. And I want to also highlight the People's Planning School. The People's Planning School effort is to ensure that community feels that planning conversations and things that we have as experiences firsthand become part of the narrative as to what our city should look like, prioritizing the needs and wants and aspirations to a healthier Long Beach come through the community that is the most impacted, because community knows the answers and the solutions to the things that impact them the most, and who better to have these conversations but you all. So just wanted to remind you, these are just tools, but at the end of the day, it's all about your strength, your knowledge, and your context for this to be possible. So reminding you why the People's Planning School takes place. So let's get started. We're going to have Avi actually break down some of the data for how youth are impacted by housing. So go ahead, take it away, Avi.
Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. My name's V. We did some research a couple months ago to try and get a little bit more background info on kind of what housing looks like for Long Beach currently, how that compares to what people's wages look like, how affordable things have gotten unaffordable. And I think we can just get right into it. Um, and Marlene, you mentioned that you were going to share the slides for.
Yes, you got it. I am ready to present whenever you are. You're ready for me to get started?
Yep.
Okay, are you seeing my host screen, or just the, sorry, folks. Having a little bit of technical difficulties. It didn't give me the option of just the screen. All right. Just a slideshow, correct?
Just a slideshow, yeah.
Um,
So getting into it, the first thing that we wanted to take a look at is what are wages looking like in LA County and kind of California in general. This chart that you're seeing on this first slide, this is the the average household wages in LA County from about 2000, I believe 2009 to up to 2023. And this chart, what kind of stands out to me at first is that very significant dip from about 2010 to 2015. Most of us on this call are probably familiar with why that's the case. That was the 2008 recession, and it was absolutely devastating for families of color, Latino households, Black households, Native American households. It was really, really bad. It took about 10 years for wages to recover from pre-recession levels. And since then, since that recovery, wages have only gone up about 11%. And to put that in perspective a little bit, when 2008 happened, the bottom half of the country, the net worth in all of those households reverted back to before 1989. I was trying to find some data for before 1989, but I couldn't find it. And again, the data showed that it took about 10 years, took about until 2018 for that household wealth to get back to where it was pre-pandemic. And that was really, really rough on Black Latino households. Um, Going over to the next slide is the I believe the average listing price for homes in California from a similar time period from about 2018 to now. That that number has increased by about 60%. Um, and that's just single family homes, right? This isn't even taking into account renters. When we look at renters, we see that that Latino households, Black households, there's a much, much higher chance that you are going to be an extremely low income household compared to white renters. You're actually 2 to 3 times more likely to be an extremely low income renter if you're Latino or Black compared to if you were white. And this rent burden, it disproportionately affects people of color, people who are Latino, and people who are Black. Uh, we can go to the next slide. This chart, this was pulled from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And this shows the percentages of households that are cost burdened or severely cost burdened. And what that means is these are the households that are paying over 30% of their income just housing. And that is very, very hard to live with. This has detrimental effects on communities and children's well-being. There are studies that suggest that this rent burden, it affects children's well-being through both material hardship and family stress. We know that if we have higher portion of our income going to our housing costs, that means there's less money for food, there's less money for medical bills, there's less money for transportation, there's less money for just leisure, taking care of yourself. And that gets passed on to our kids, both through family stress and also the material hardship. Um, Whenever rent is really high, we have to move around more, right? And there's a study that looks at the effects of this housing instability on children's adverse childhood experiences, their ACEs. And this study found that for each move that a family makes, their ACE score increases by about 3 folds. Another study focused on kids in LA County also confirmed that the severe housing cost burden is associated with increased chances of adverse childhood experiences. Oh, I'm sorry, Marlon. That was the next slide. And how does this the adverse effects of high housing costs, how does that contribute to homelessness? Well, there's a study done. It was called the California Statewide Study of People Experiencing Homelessness, and they recorded that the high cost of housing is the second most common economic reason for these people to leave housing. And once you become homeless, you're going to be homeless for about 2 years. For children, once they are homeless, this is associated with increased incidences of trauma, of PTSD. There was a study that found that 68.5% of kids that experienced homelessness experienced physical victimization, and almost a quarter experienced sexual victimization. So we know that housing is tied to homelessness, and homelessness directly affects, it has a lot of really adverse effects for children. So what is the state of California doing to address this problem? Well, the state of California, they have a process for kind of figuring out how many units of housing the state needs. And this is broken up by county, by city, and this is called the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, RENA. And so far, it has not been it has not been effective for producing the amount of housing that we need. So the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, it's the first two steps of a multi-step process that the California government uses to plan housing for each region. And we're currently in the sixth RENA cycle. It's 8 years in total, from October 2021 to October 2029. So how does our progress look right now with RENA? And that's going to be on the next slide. So right now, the target for Long Beach was about 26,500 units. Currently, we are only at 2,283 units built. Now, this was these numbers are coming from, I believe, May, June of this year. So that could be a little bit higher at this point. But that's definitely nowhere near high enough. That's less than 10% of the actual progress that the progress has been made to our goal. And that's including all of our housing. That's extremely low income, very low income, moderate, and market rate. For just very low income and low income housing, we're talking about less than 5%. And again, this is going to be mainly Latino households, Black households, Native American households. It's a lot of people of color that are going to be higher, they're going to be more rent burdened, and their needs are not being met in this RENA process. So the next slide is going to compare the local housing issue. Sorry about that. That's going to compare local to national. So how do things look nationally? Well, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, they found that there's a national shortage of over 7 million rental units affordable and available to the lowest income renters. And California has the largest deficit in the country at almost 1 million. And next slide, please. So how does that look for the LA, Long Beach, California metro area? For us, we are at just a little over 384,000 for our deficit. And that's one of the highest in the nation. That is top 10 shortages in the country for California. It's bad. Going back to kind of the wages, this wasn't in the data set, but in order to afford a 2-bedroom household in California, you have to make about $49 per hour, which translates to just about $100,000 a year. And that's only to make sure that you're paying 30% of your income towards your rent. A lot of people are not at that level. A lot of people in the service sector, a lot of people in healthcare and very labor intensive jobs, they're not making anywhere close to those levels. You would need to work 120 hours per week at a minimum wage, at California minimum wage, to be able to afford that 2-bedroom household. It's unsustainable for most of our community. And the current housing policies are not, they're just not meeting our needs. So this was why we think that Long Beach should really pursue shelter housing in using the funds that are available. Now, I think the next slide will have some information about the Australian and Vienna systems. So we know that Australia has a social housing model and Vienna also has a social housing model. The Australian social housing model was researched a little bit, and researchers found that participation from tenants helps residents they develop valuable skills. You know, we feel like we have there's a sense of dignity, there's a sense of pride. We can learn how to take care of our own communities. They found that these social housing programs positively contributed to education, employment, and social engagement for highly vulnerable groups living in social housing. Um, when the Viennese model was studied a little bit more, um, well, the Viennese model is a little different in that there's not a ton of public data available for it, but it seems more successful because it does promote permanent affordable housing versus just being a temporary solution. Um, and that's really kind of the main points that we found. Wages really aren't keeping up with what we need to afford housing. The housing costs are through the roof. We don't have enough housing being built, especially not enough dedicated to people who are low income, Latino households, Black households. And that's really the big kind of the big picture that we got to.
Thank you, V. Appreciate it. Thank you for breaking that down and sharing some of your findings. Appreciate you.
Mhm.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and introduce James, who's gonna walk us through the next portion of our presentation. And James is gonna tell us about zoning rules and community and family building. So take it away, James.
All right, good evening, everyone. I am going to give a moment just to share my screen and then allow our interpreters just a little bit of a break. And I appreciate y'all helping ensure that all of this information, which is very technical by nature, can be accessible for all of the folks who are watching right now and watching this later on. Okay, so just as Marlene mentioned, my name is James. I am one of the directors here at Long Beach Forward, and I am part of our organizing team for the People's Planning School. So just as Marlene mentioned earlier, the People's Planning School is our community effort to really ensure that we can democratize urban planning and the ideas of what it takes to actually build and have a environment in our neighborhoods and our communities that are truly representative of the needs, but also the desires and solutions that we know are effective to help us build healthier communities, more safer communities, and have more of a sense of community in our own neighborhoods as well. Oftentimes, these concepts and ideas are usually reserved for folks who may have the higher education or have the means or the technical experience. But part of our philosophy and idea around the People's Planning School is that we and the folks who live in the neighborhoods, who have our lived experience, who struggle with these larger social inequities, we know what the solutions are. And we want everybody to be part of that solution together. And so that's what the People's Planning School is all about. And just as V shared recently in talking about, we know the numbers, we know the need, we're really interested in how do we actually put all of those ideas and the data together to actually make concrete changes in the community. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about urban planning for communities and families and why it's important for us to make these connections and talk about these concepts, whether it's in our own specific neighborhoods, whether it's in neighborhoods that are surrounding our communities as well, and both in Long Beach and also and beyond. So first, I want you to think about some of the problems in Long Beach's built environment. And when I say built environment, I want you to think about the things that you see visibly outside, right? When you walk out to a park, not every park, but some of the best parks have lots of trees, right? And there's things that we see on those trees, which are the branches, the leaves. We know that we've been in a drought for a long time, so sometimes our trees aren't looking the healthiest, right? But the visible things that we see in our built environment, we know what those issues are, right? Oftentimes, some of the biggest things that we hear from community and that many of us on this conversation have our own lived experiences with are things like community safety, feeling safe in a neighborhood, and whether there's a proper lighting, whether it feels like, is it okay for me to walk down the street? Do I know that like people in my neighborhood know who I am or that people are looking out for me? But on a really basic level, it's also about neighborhood cleanliness. How is trash being picked up? Are there enough places for trash to go? Are the streets and the alleys and are the environment around our schools and parks even well maintained? Our built environment is also about things like parking and public transportation. So it includes how we actually get around from point A to point B, whether we're leaving our home to go to school, to go to the grocery store, to go to our workplaces. We know that a lot of parts of Long Beach are really parking challenged. And at the same time, not everybody even has access to a vehicle. And so ensuring that there are safe spaces or safe pathways and proper infrastructure for public transportation is really important as part of that built environment. For me, I'm a big fan of Long Beach Transit, but also I get really frustrated when there's a major street and a very small bus stop with no bus shelter because right now we're in the middle of a heat wave. And so it's really important that even if there isn't proper shade for people waiting for the bus, that's a huge safety concern. That's a huge health concern. And that's all part of our built environment. Park space is also a huge piece of the built environment. So not just whether we have access to park space, but also is that park space accessible? Is it safe to be able to be in? And also, is it enjoyable, right? There are many parts of Long Beach that are what are considered park poor, meaning that there's not safe and close access to a park. There's other communities and oftentimes are wealthier neighborhoods that have huge access and much more spacious parks that span from multiple city blocks. And lastly, we all know that housing is a huge problem in Long Beach. It's not just in Long Beach. As a country, we've been in a housing crisis for a very long time. And we're going to talk a little bit more about it. And just as V shared with us some of the data, housing is a huge piece of that built environment because it's about how are we using the land and building the neighborhoods around us, and how does that in turn impact both us as individuals, but also as families, and lastly, as whole communities. So I'm sure hearing all of this, you can identify, and yes, you've seen all of these problems and they exist. And it can often be really overwhelming to figure out where do we start to address these problems. Part of the People's Planning School is really important to understand why do these problems exist in the first place, right? Because we really want to challenge our thinking to say, maybe it's not just that people choose to be violent. Maybe it's not that people are just dirty. Maybe it's not that people just can't save money to access to a car, right? In reality, these problems are way bigger and much more complex. And so just as we look at that tree and we may see all of those things that are visible to our eyes, we also have to understand that there's so much underneath the ground below that tree that allow that tree to even exist in the first place, right? So think of these as the roots of these problems. And there's a lot of larger systemic problems or roots that contribute to these problems. So for instance, and this is really where we're going to start our conversation and focus in on, are a couple different things. And this isn't meant to be a complete list, but at least a starting point for us to start in wrapping our thinking and helping understand how do we actually solve these problems in the first place. The first that I want to lift up is historic redlining. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But redlining, as many of you may know, refers to a practice between the federal government, the federal United States government, and private banks to limit financial investments in specific neighborhoods based on the racial makeup of those neighborhoods. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but I highlight this because it was a decision that was based off of discriminatory beliefs around race and class. Even though redlining was declared illegal in the 1968 Fair Housing Act, we still to this day have continued underinvestment in public infrastructure. So we know that even in Long Beach, driving through certain parts of central Long Beach, the west side, or the north side, they look very different from places like Belmont Shore, or around Cal State Long Beach, or even around Bixby Knolls. And so that physical infrastructure continues to be underinvested in because of these generations of intentional disinvestment. At the same time, we also have very intentional national and local housing and zoning policies that tell us where housing should be built, what kind of housing should be built, and what kind of money we're actually putting into housing. Oftentimes in community organizing and in the work that we often support, we talk about housing as a human right, meaning that everybody deserves the right to a healthy and safe home. It's a really grand idea, and it's something that myself and a lot of people on this call share that belief. Yet the reality is that in the United States, housing policy is centered around the idea that housing has to be profitable, meaning people have to be able to make money off of housing, and that's what we call commodified. So at the end of the day, it's really difficult to build a lot of affordable housing or ensure that housing is affordable when it needs to be profitable for someone, whether that's a landlord, whether that's a private developer. It's really difficult to ensure that housing can be affordable when all of our housing policy is very restrictive or focused on making sure that people are able to turn a profit. And to that end, another huge root of this problem is the ongoing and increased privatization. And by privatization, we mean the process of public goods, public services, and public spaces becoming privatized and owned by private individuals or companies, meaning that they're not accessible to everyone, and meaning that we're losing the opportunity for public spaces like well-funded libraries, supportive parks, grand public spaces where people can gather and connect. And at the same time, we're seeing an increase in surveillance in these privatized spaces where certain people aren't allowed or people don't feel safe anymore in their own communities and their own neighborhoods that they live in. And lastly, one of the big roots of these problems is racism and classism. These beliefs, these discriminatory beliefs around the color of our skin, our race and ethnicity, or also about how much money we make, what class status we're in, whether we're poor or middle income. And oftentimes we see increased crimes, what we call crimes of poverty, right? Where individuals who may not have a lot of means or financial means or money oftentimes are over surveillanced, are oftentimes policed out of certain neighborhoods, and disadvantaged in so many different ways because of actions that have happened over generations. So I'll give you an example, and I want to go back to historic redlining, how all of these pieces are overconnected. So if you're not familiar, as I mentioned, redlining was a practice where banks and the federal government took literal maps of large urban communities. Long Beach was not immune to this, and drew boundaries of where financial investments would go purely based on the racial and ethnic composition of those neighborhoods. At the same time, people of color, as they came to many different urban areas, as migration across the country and different communities escaped segregation or civil war in their respective communities, they were forced to live in very specific parts of different cities, including Long Beach. And these were the communities where they had no other option to live, yet at the same time, there were legal methods to be able to say there's no financial investment, we're not going to invest resources, or even if people have the financial means or the credit worthiness. Here on this map, you can see an overlaid redlining map with a map of Long Beach and show the green and blue neighborhoods that have levels of high investment. So if you're in front of a computer, I invite you to share in the chat if you see which neighborhoods you see in the green and blue, and which neighborhoods you see in the yellow and red. These yellow and red neighborhoods were the ones that were considered hazardous and risky neighborhoods for investing, for lending, and it made it extremely difficult for people of color to be able to not just buy homes, but also build generational wealth. That idea is really important to understand because, again, even though this wasn't declared an illegal practice in 1968, there are still cases being proven that private banks are continuing these discriminatory practices targeting Black individuals and families, but also the fact that even for so many families who were denied the opportunity to build generational wealth, that still carries impacts even today, even over 50 years later after the end of redlining, where individuals are still living, continuing to live paycheck to paycheck, and that idea of building wealth or building even economic security over time has been denied to so many families purely based because of the neighborhood that they live in. This conversation is also really important because when we talk about and hear about ideas around gentrification and displacement, when we talk about people being forced out because of different forces and new development or being priced out of their neighborhoods, it's specifically because of this kind of intentional and disinvestment based around race and class over generations that are now facing this really harsh reality that for us here in Long Beach and Los Angeles County, we're in built out communities. We can't build out to the south because of the ocean, and we don't build out north because we hit mountains. And oftentimes we're hearing so many stories of people who grew up in Long Beach or in the surrounding neighborhoods who now live out in the Inland Empire, out in the high desert, Palmdale, Lancaster, because how expensive it's getting and how often there's luxury development or even market rate development happening in these very yellow and red neighborhoods that for a very long time were affordable because they were passed over, because they were discriminated against. Yet now, because of our policies, these areas are now profitable. And it makes sense for individuals to be able to make money because that's how our housing policy is structured. So I want to talk about urban planning and I want to talk about zoning because this is a really strong key and solution that we have to start actually correcting some of these injustices. And although everything I pointed out seems really broad and really difficult to comprehend or even think about how we start to change that, those were all man-made decisions, person-made decisions, if you will. And so we can change that at the same time by talking about these issues and also organizing on these same issues as well. So zoning, if you're not familiar, is a part of urban planning that talks about all these different facets of how we build out a community and a neighborhood. It covers things like land use, what gets built where. It talks about the building heights. It talks about the density or the idea of how many units or apartments or families or individuals are concentrated in one area. It talks about setbacks, thinking about the open space on streets and in sidewalks and how far buildings should be set back to allow for that kind of safe passage. It also includes things like parking and transportation, but also the physical landscaping. And lastly, open space and amenities that exist within our neighborhoods. So hopefully hearing this, you can start to think about your own neighborhood and the way some of these pieces either show up, what they look like, or maybe if they're absent. For a long time in the neighborhood that I grew up in, we often didn't have the same kind of paved sidewalks, or we didn't have general landscaping, or we didn't have a lot of street lights, right? And those are all decisions and priorities about where resources go and how neighborhoods are designed, right? That is a very different experience from neighborhoods like Bluff Park or Bixby Knolls or California Heights, where there's a lot of investment and a lot of historic investment in the infrastructure in a neighborhood. So why does this all matter? And specifically, why should it matter to us as parents and caregivers and people thinking about how do we build the best kind of community for our families? So like I mentioned, zoning and urban planning is about land use. How we're using and designating the physical land in our communities, whether it's a mix of residential, meaning homes, but also commercial, like businesses, small businesses, markets and stores, but also industrial. There are many neighborhoods in Long Beach where you saw on that map that were previously redlined, where you have large warehouses right up against apartment buildings or homes. These are all land use decisions about talking about what can be built where and how we can create buffers and safeguards to protect people, not just their physical safety, but also their own health from different types of commercial or industrial uses as well. Zoning and urban planning also talks about height and density. Height and density is really important because this could impact affordability within different housing projects, or ensuring that, as again, with current housing policy, if housing is to be profitable, then that it can still stay affordable for people who may need to rent, or if they're trying to own, or looking at other models like social housing, which is what we'll talk about. But also oftentimes we want more public transit and we want safe transit access. And the reality is that we need dense housing that people can live around focused corridors or streets to be able to have robust public transit. I love when a bus comes every 12 minutes. It makes it really easy to be able to go wherever you need to go, as long as those buses run on time. And so that density is really important for us to be able to have. But at the same time, dense neighborhoods help give people more social connectedness. So people feel like they have more of a connection to their neighbors. People are able to share public space together rather than be so far apart and feel really distanced from each other. Zoning also talks about setbacks, which helps us create safe and accessible streets. So even ensuring that we have enough sidewalk, not just for people to be able to walk, but also for those of us in our families who may have disabilities and may need extra space. But also we enjoy space to allow vendors to be on streets and be able to have these kinds of third spaces where people can come together and share food together. And so those setbacks about how far buildings should be from streets or what kind of amenities should exist on a street is all about zoning and urban planning. Parking and transit is really important, as I mentioned, to have multiple transportation options for people. For the reality is that it's really expensive to own a car or to be able to have and maintain a car in not just Long Beach, but in Southern California. And so zoning helps us ensure that we have transit options for people. Lastly, landscaping, open space and amenities. These are all about the beauty and also the sustainability of our neighborhoods. And having access to third spaces and public amenities. If you're not familiar with the idea of a third space, it's the idea that it's not your home, it's not your workplace, but these are places where community can gather, can come together, whether those are community centers, whether those are houses of worship, whether they're public plazas, even for people to be able to come, that are open, that are safe. That's really important, especially for individuals and families who are looking for spaces to be able to gather, to be able to come together safely and enjoy the outdoor environment, and the fact that we live in Southern California, which has beautiful weather most of the time. So lastly, I want to talk about how we actually start to address and change all of this. And that's what we call community-led planning. Historically, and oftentimes when I talk about all of these problems that I've just mentioned, it's because urban planning and zoning has been led by individuals who are not from a community or really disconnected from a community, and they don't share the same priorities as many of us who may identify as people of color, maybe low income, or even have that direct experience in a neighborhood. And so community-led planning is about many principles. Tonight, I want to talk about four main purposes that connect to the People's Planning School and the work that we hope that you would join us for in the future. The first is that people most impacted are involved in leading processes. So in the last version of the People's Planning School and locally here in Long Beach, there was an entire effort around the rezoning of the Anaheim Street corridor from the Washington neighborhood to Cambodia Town to the Zafaria neighborhood. And it's so important that individuals who understand the problems that exist in the community are educated about what solutions there are and actually leading that process. Because that in turn leads to people being empowered to make decisions about their community. Oftentimes, especially if our neighborhoods aren't well taken care of, it can be difficult to have pride in our own neighborhoods or feel like we really want to be more connected, but we may not feel safe or we may not know people in the neighborhood. And so being involved in these kinds of efforts helps people to be not just empowered about making decisions, but also to be able to be connected in their own communities. Community-led planning is also about creating a plan for sustainability and for prioritizing communities, not necessarily just profit and money to be made for a wealthy few. So community-led planning is really important because sustainability means we're the ones who live in our neighborhood and we're going to take care of our own neighborhoods for the long term. And we care about the livelihoods, not just for our current selves, but our future families, for our future generations, and also for our own climate and our own planet. And to that end, it's really important to understand that in zoning and urban planning, people are engaged for the long term, meaning that we can have these visions and ideas, and we absolutely should, about housing, around parks, around what's accessible in our neighborhoods. We start with zoning and land use as this root cause, but we may not see our vision for many years. It may not even be 5 years, maybe not even a decade, right? But we have to start with a plan. And this is our tangible opportunity to start righting these wrongs that we've historically seen happen in our communities. So lastly, I hope you feel motivated and excited to get to work. We'll talk a little bit more at the end about some next steps with the People's Planning School. But I hope that you understand a little bit more about the context and importance of urban planning and zoning. And with that, I will pass it back over to Marlene.
Thank you, James, for walking us through that and breaking it down. I know that this is just like a little teaser taster situation that we anticipate doing a more extended version of this. So I just want to say, like, if this is something that you're really interested in having further conversations about, keep an eye out because there will be more conversations about this and further involvement in the community because we're anticipating way more conversations about that in our neighborhoods. So this is just for you to conceptualize it and get to understand what planning is about because we know that this is an extended conversation that has so many elements. Every single little title on the tree that James just went over is actually like one element that could be a whole conversation. So I don't want people to leave here like fully energized, feeling like, oh, this is it. There's not anymore. And I just want to anticipate by saying there is way more than just what you just experienced through James's presentation. So keep an eye out. And I don't want us to walk away with just feeling like, oh my God, all these conversations just took place with no follow-up. So I'm gonna transition this into Donna presenting the concept of social housing for folks to begin to understand that like this is one of the solutions or one of the ways that we want to anticipate community getting involved. So Donna, go ahead. You want to introduce yourself, say your name, your pronouns, and maybe what you're part of at Long Beach Forward?
Can you hear me?
Donna, can you do another sound test?
Hello?
Yeah, you're all good.
Okay. Okay, good. So my name's Donna. Pronouns are she, her. I have been with Long Beach Forward a couple months now. I started in their leadership training program, and then I switched over to a youth summit where we also share and expose social housing with a smaller youth between the ages of like 14 and 24. So I've just been volunteering in my spare time, and that's a little bit about me. I think I'm gonna start the presentation for social housing. Yeah, there we go. Awesome. Okay. So it's gonna be like a quick little crash course on what social housing is. Can we switch over to the next slide? Okay, so what is the current housing problem right now? So right now, nearly 50% of renters nationwide are rent burdened, meaning 30% of their income is spent on rent and utilities. And nearly 25% of renters spent 50% of their income solely on housing. This is also a racial justice issue, as we will see in the next chart. On the next page, as we see, over 50% of people are rent burdened. This chart shows you a breakdown of the percentage by race/ethnicity in Long Beach as of 2017. Switch over to the next slide. James was mentioning the redlining. This is a glimpse of the map as we see towards west side of Long Beach. It's more on the yellow side. I'm sorry, yellow color. We see that this is, oh, I'm sorry. On the yellow side, we see sorry, I'm having like, I don't know if it's on my end. I think I'm having internet connection, but I think we're good. Okay, I think we're good now. On the yellow side, on the west side of Long Beach, we see how the broken down I'm sorry.
All right, folks, seems like Donna's having a little bit of internet challenges and I can gladly step in and support her. I'm gonna go ahead and continue to present while she gets her internet situation situated. Give me a second. All right, we know that the areas in the yellow are the areas with the lowest income, and similar to the chart James showed us in regards to red zoning, we know that the areas with low resources are also the areas that were historically red zoned. So it's by design that the city looks this way. And we know the areas with the higher maroon color are the higher resourced areas. So just reminding us that like the city looks the way it does by design. The city definitely is not by accident, and it's not people's choices that our city looks this way. I mean, not individual people's, it's a systematic challenge. So I just want to highlight that um the city looks this way by design, and as such there's definitely an opportunity for us to design it in a way that creates equity and balance within our communities. I want to take a second. I think the next slide is kind of powerful, especially when we're talking about communities that we work with and ourselves. And I want us to take a second to take a look how income is broken down, and take a second and find your own family. Where do you fall in regards to income? So look at the portion, like the size of your family, how many people compose it, and then go ahead and see where your basic income falls into. Where do you fall? And I want you to keep
I don't
this in
know, I'm just
mind.
like I froze and nothing would
I
come
want
up.
you to keep that in mind as we move forward to the next couple of slides. All right. All right. And I just want to highlight this moment to remind us that housing has 3 Ps, and that means the production of new housing, which means building new affordable housing, and affordable with a capital F, right? Like real affordable housing, and then land use to create affordable housing. So how do we use the actual land, dirt, to create that affordable housing? Then there's preservation of existing housing, right? We know that there is already housing that has been created, does already exist, and how do we preserve it in order for folks not to be displaced? And lastly, tenant protections. A lot of the work, that policy that has been going on, and all of these things are very important and interdependent of each other. They all 3 have to go hand in hand in order to ensure that they actually create a balanced and thriving community. And one cannot happen without the other, because then we're basically creating a system that's gonna like implode on itself. And the reason I want to highlight this is that the housing issue that we're facing has to be addressed in multiple angles. It has to be, we need to produce, we need to preserve, and we need to protect, and all 3 have to be playing at the same time. And so I think a lot of people have been hearing the concept of social housing. And I just want to take this moment to remind folks, social housing is permanently affordable and community managed. So it means that community has a strong say in how it is ran. And also it means that for the existence of that building being upright, or the land being used, that it is permanently affordable. And I just want to say why, I just want to highlight the difference between capital F and lowercase f. And I know in Spanish that doesn't translate very well, but like, what does real affordability mean? So these little cute houses kind of break down the 4 different ways of housing. So the first one means state government rent. So that's public housing. And I think a lot of our community members might be familiar with this type of housing. We actually have a public housing in the city of Long Beach at Carmelitos. And Carmelitos means that it is state government run, and it's 25% of income. And the reason it's able to be that affordable, it's because it's public housing, and it's managed by community housing providers, and or in our situation, the county. So the county of LA actually manages Carmelitos. It's followed by community housing, which is also known as social housing, and it is run by housing orgs. 30% of your income is about rental assistance. And I think the following one, the orange colored one, is the next level of it, which is run by housing organizations. And this is what a lot of community members, especially in the United States, we call affordable. But in reality, it's run by housing orgs or private agents, and it's usually 75 to 80% of market rate, and it's defined by developers. So a lot of the times, developers advocate or dictate a lot of the affordable housing breakdown because they're trying to break some type of profit. In contrast to social housing or public housing, the purpose is to house people. Affordable housing is still trying to create a money for a developer. And lastly, private, like the market rate housing, which is basically what V was mentioning earlier, how inaccessible it has become for our community, even more after the housing crash or the financial crash. And these are private agents. It goes to the higher bidder, and usually it depends on who can afford it. And the reality is, most of our community cannot afford these high bidding or market rate housing. So I just want to take a second for folks to kind of see the array of colors of what is these housing breakdowns, and for us to acknowledge that even for myself, like I cannot afford a market rate housing, and how many of us, especially in my generation, will most likely not be able to afford a market rate housing unless the system of housing changes. So I want to break down what social housing is, because this is something that I believe a lot of our community leaders are very invested in, because we see this as a response to give more stability and agency for our community members. So just to highlight what that means, it means it may be occupied by renters as well as homeowners. So there's definitely a pathway for homeowners to actually rent those homes, including, and it includes public housing for the lowest income and most marginalized residents. So ensuring that community members that are struggling are prioritized, but it also has, it's also affordable option for low and moderate income households. So really diversifying the income in an attempt to creating a more thriving community, and preventing isolation from low-income communities, which is one of the challenges around public housing at this moment. So this is an attempt to create a balance in that. And we know that social housing is socially owned. That means as a collective community come together to create like a structure for mutual agreements and community. So a good example of this is public housing, community land trusts, limited equity tenant cooperatives, and international social housing systems. And there's an array of ways social housing can look like. There's multiple models, and I just want to take a second to give a shout out to Libre, who has been incubating a community land trust. And so I believe that they're definitely in a phase of implementation, and we will see our first community land trust in the next couple of, like, pretty soon. So just wanted to highlight that and reminding folks that there's multiple models. It's not just one way. And it also means it's permanently affordable. That means that even the low-income residents will be able to access it, because social housing residents should pay over 30% of their income on the housing costs. So as you all remember, V mentioned how rent burden we are in the city of Long Beach, and this is one of the mechanisms to prevent that from being the reality. And permanently decommodified, it means it's being protected from for-profit investors. It must never be resold for profit. So in order to ensure that land is accessible, it should be treated as a human need, not as a commodity to provide profit for landlords or investors. So I just want to highlight this part, because it's not that the first generation of homeowners are going to only have that benefit. It's that it's almost like a system to allow community members that come after the first owners to actually have that access. And then it's under community control. So develop, own, managed, and operated in a way that is accountable to residents, the community, and the public. So the residents should have a direct role in management and decision making, including through tenant unions. So just ensuring that community has a thorough input, and like V mentioned in his findings, that this creates a sense of ownership and agency for community members. The fifth thing, it's anti-racist and equitable. It's designed to protect the racial and gender equity and displacements of communities of color. And we know from a prior slides or prior data that women of color, especially single mothers of color, are the most disproportionately impacted by displacement in the city of Long Beach. And also immigration status and criminal records should not disqualify people from residency, because we know a lot of our communities have come in contact with the quote unquote criminal justice system. And of course, immigration status should not play a role in these values. 6, it's sustainable. Built use green construction methods according to the principles of energy efficiency design and disaster resilience. We know that in order for this housing to be sustainable, it has to be thinking of into the future and making it sustainable. And it's high quality and accessible, high quality and built to last. We don't want these buildings to crumble within a first generation. We want multiple generations to be able to live in these homes. It should be accessible to all people, regardless of age, physical needs, or other factors. And lastly, with tenant security, operated within a set of principles that protect tenants from evictions and displacement, such as rent regulations, just cause protections, right to counsel, and the right to organize, and more. We know that we want tenant protections within these properties as well. And I just want to remind people, we are still in the early phases. And I think in conversations with our community leaders, we have made it an effort and a very clear purpose that it's going to take some years, because there's so much process to be created around this. There's going to be a couple of needs in order for social housing to exist in Long Beach in more than just one area. We're going to need additional funding. There's going to have to be real advocacy on the ground to get funding, to get land. And land is going to be a challenge too. Long Beach has very limited land. So we're going to have to be very creative about where we get land, and also removing the red tape, ensuring that those barriers are removed so we can create social housing. And lastly, power from the tenants. And this is you all, this is your power. This is where your conversations come in. This is where all of your input is super important, because like I said, Long Beach Forward is a space, but it can only be real through you all. And I just want to highlight one of the examples, which is Vienna in Austria. And I think some of our other presenters also highlighted this, which is ranked as the city with the highest quality of life, partly due to its quality affordable housing, which began with 65,000 public housing units between the 1920s and the 30s. And now it homes about 1 million people, which is more than half of the population, 60% of the population. So I just want to say, we're not pushing for something new. This is something that has existed for quite some time. And I think one of the beautiful things about the Vienna model is that it created housing not just for the sake of sticking people in homes, but actually thinking of the holistic perspective from people. Like, how do you build something that's going to create a thriving and healthy community that actually is conducive to people feeling proud to call this neighborhood or this area home? So I just want to take a second to really highlight that the Vienna model is really centered around like thriving communities. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and thank you so much to everyone for listening to this part of the presentation. Also, Donna, I hope your tech issues were solved, and oh, I just realized you guys were not seeing me all this time, and I was being so expressive with my face and all the things that I was saying. Thank you so much to James for reminding me that I was definitely not presenting with all my enthusiasm to you all. All right, folks, I am going to go ahead and pass it on to James, who is going to take us through the last portion of our conversation today.
All right, thank you, Marlene, and thank you to V and Donna for joining us and helping share all this information, for all of you all for joining and watching tonight. So I want to leave us on a couple next steps and encourage folks in using this time to be able to, one, my ask of all of you is to, over the next week, to take a walk in your neighborhood, take a drive in your neighborhood, or if for any reason you don't feel safe or comfortable, which is completely valid, just any moment that you have, even to think about looking outside your window or your own neighborhood, to really think about what you see in your own neighborhood, what are the challenges, what are the problems, but also what would be your vision for what a safer or what a more connected neighborhood would actually be. All of this starts with our vision. Oftentimes we think our visions are really lofty or maybe they're unattainable, but that's not what we should be starting at to think about for a vision. We should think about what doesn't exist yet, so that way we can ensure that that actually comes to fruition. So I want you to, that's your homework assignment, is to think about your own neighborhood, the environment that you're in, and the conditions around your neighborhood, and think about how they could be different. Second, I also want you to, if you are really interested, because we hear a lot of challenges with housing, not just around affordability, but around safety, around the protections for housing. I really want to encourage you to join any of the many local efforts happening around housing. Marlene and any of us on this webinar are happy to connect and help connect, whether it's to the Social Housing Committee, whether it's to the Long Beach Housing for All Community Land Trust, Long Beach Residents Empowered, the Long Beach Tenants Union. There are a plethora of organizations to get involved with, because the reality is that we all need to be involved and need to start somewhere. Even if that means starting in your own building, to be able to organize with your own neighbors and tenants, to be able to have your own tenant union. Third, I also want to invite and encourage all of you, especially for those of you who live in the Rose Park and Alamitos Beach neighborhoods, to consider joining our People's Planning School, or think about the people that you know who live in the neighborhood to join the upcoming and future People's Planning School in the new year. Currently, the city of Long Beach has led several different community-based zoning efforts to help update the zoning and the land use regulations and the rules of what can be built and where in different parts of the community across the city. Some community members, actually, and some people on this call were part of the previous effort around the rezoning of the Anaheim Street corridor. And in the coming years, the city will be rezoning a large area that many of us actually frequent and many of us live in, known as, or this project is being called, from 10th Street to Broadway. And so as you're looking at this map, it might be a little hard to see, but this is right up against the coastline, and a really pivotal area, not just for those of us who live in the neighborhood, but also for any of us who live in the northern or central parts of Long Beach. This is a critical area for allowing people to have coastal access, because the reality is access to the beach and the coast shouldn't be just for people who have means or who are wealthy. It should be accessible for everyone. And so having a safe and well-connected environment in this part of Long Beach is critical to everyone who lives in the city. And when you look at this large piece of this zoning puzzle within the city, this is roughly about Alamitos and Cerritos streets, avenues, all the way over to Recreation Park and a little bit beyond over to Bellflower. So if you're familiar with Long Beach geography, it's a really broad area that's extremely diverse. And diverse in many ways, not just when it comes to race and income, but also when you think about income and poverty. As you look at this map, you can see from the city of Long Beach's data set that the darker purple and as the different shades go, the darker purple have higher percentage of individuals who are living twice below the federal poverty line, not just below the federal poverty line, but we're talking twice below the federal poverty line. And as it gets lighter gray to the lightest gray, or lightest purple, sorry, that means there's less percentage of poverty, right? And so oftentimes we talk about these different comparisons and different lived realities where even within just a mile's distance, there's still a huge difference in terms of opportunity and concentrations. And we talked about concentrations of wealth and poverty in the past earlier in this teach-in. And so you can see in the western part of this area, especially around 7th Street, around 4th Street, around Walnut, around Orange, around Cherry, there are neighborhoods that are not just very dense, but also have large concentrations of poverty concentrated in those areas. But just as we mentioned before, it's not just about these one issues, it's also about how they're all compounded, right? So according to the city of Long Beach, these same areas that experience not just high rates of poverty and twice the poverty rate, also have high rates of extreme risk of displacement or even high risk of displacement, meaning that there's a large chance that these households and these individuals are at risk of losing their homes or maybe forced out of the neighborhoods, right? And so these are areas with a high and extreme displacement risk around Almond Avenue, Junipero Avenue, Orange Avenue, Nebraska, Appleton, even 4th and 7th Streets. And so these are neighborhoods that we really want to ensure that people who live in these neighborhoods, the families that are part of these neighborhoods, are part of these processes and have a say in the shaping of their own neighborhoods and their own environments. So if you live in any of these neighborhoods and in these priority communities, or if you know friends and family who do, please let them know about this teach-in. We're going to share all the materials from this tonight, and this presentation is going to be made available and accessible in English and Spanish online. So feel free to share this resource to them and let them know that come early 2026, they can be part of the People's Planning School to ensure that the community priorities of the neighborhood here are reflective in whatever the actual city council will finally adopt in the years to come. Like I said, it's not important just for the people who live in the neighborhood, but for all of us who care about equal and accessible access to our coast, to our beaches, and for safe spaces for our families to be able to come together, to be able to gather, and to be able to play together. So with that, I want to thank you all. Do you want to share anything else, Marlene, to close this out? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here and for spending a little bit of your evening with us at this teach-in. Again, thank you to V and to Donna for all of your contributions and sharing your insights. All of this information will be accessible. Please consider sharing it with your friends and your families. And I hope you all have a great rest of your evening. Goodbye.
Have a good night.